Okay, we're now live. So welcome everyone to the third of this series of events that we at UK and Changing Europe have organised with the Centre for Grand Strategy, our fantastic colleagues at KCL on the E3. Today we're discussing France. Got a superb panel. Georgina Wright, Senior Fellow and Director of the Europe Programme at the Institut Montaigne, which is a think tank that's almost as good as ours. François-Joseph Sichan. Is that right?
Well done. Yeah.
Right. Phew, I was so stressed about that. Works at Flint Global, advising clients on geopolitics and European affairs across a range of sectors. That's the second test I've passed because I was convinced I was going to say Global Council by mistake, but no, Flint Global. Last but not least, Gesine Weber is a PhD candidate here at King's College. She's written a lot for our website. If you search her on our website, you'll see the pieces she's written for us. And we're going to have a broad discussion about French security policy, how that locks into the E3 and so on. As ever, stick your questions on the Slido. And if you want to be really helpful, vote for the questions you want me to pose to the panel, because that lessens the amount of work I have to do, which is always good. So just to kick off and go in any order, you can go the order I introduced you, if you like. That might be the easiest. Where is France under President Macron when it comes to security policy? There we go. It's a nice, easy starter for 10. What are the main thrusts of his security policy? Georgie.
I mean, how long do I have? Because I think that's part of the problem with when you ask such a broad question, particularly when it comes to France, is that there's almost anything and everything that's under its foreign policy. I think the biggest shift that I've noticed in the last 2 years is the sort of framing of the discussion. The French love a good narrative and a good framing of the discussion, and it's gone really from competition to strategic confrontation. So everything that they see now is more in terms of, it's everything is linked. And so it's not just about European security to the east or to the south with the Sahel. It's also about biodiversity, climate change. It's about how the Western order or the post-Second World Order is being questioned, and how Russia and China are working much more closely together in international organizations. There's just, anytime you talk to a French foreign policy official, they will list a number of things. And I think actually, if I had to choose 3 going forward, I would say, particularly on security policy, of course, European security. So the war in Ukraine and how you respond to that. And particularly with the impending US election, we don't know whether Biden will be re-elected or whether we could see a return of Trump. Trump has, floated different things, but one of the strong signals that we're hearing from Washington and from his campaign is that potentially the US could pull out of NATO. And I think that's a real concern for France and its European allies. So I think European security is number 1. I think the Sahel is, a real important point for France, particularly because everything that happened the last year, France was being pushed out of certain countries, and no other European country really being able to replace France in that role. And then, of course, Russia's there. You've seen Chinese investment there. So I think that's going to be a key concern. And then, of course, the Indo-Pacific, because France is an Indo-Pacific power. But there, too, I think there's not a lot of clarity exactly in what they're trying to do. I think there's a recognition that the economic side of their Indo-Pacific strategy is weaker. So there's a good defense cooperation with a number of countries. There's obviously military presence in the region. But there's a question of how we could improve investment. So I'm going to go with those 3, but I could name many others.
Okay, well, François-Joseph, building on that, what are the as part of your answer, you don't have to focus just on this. What are the institutional mechanisms that France is prioritizing? So, the relative places of institutions like NATO and the EU in the Macron vision. If the original question is broad enough, that's now broader.
Yeah, I think the EU is definitely the key priority for Macron. It has been since 2017, and it continues to be. And I agree with Georgina with this kind of holistic approach that the French are taking to foreign policy. This is very true. But I think what is underpinning the French approach on all of this is really the concern that the European Union is at risk of losing influence, of declining influence over having an influence on protecting its interest, advancing its interest abroad in the context of big power competition. So I think Macron has been trying for the past few years to explain to other EU member states that we need to we need more EU integration on key issues, foreign policy and defense, but also on economic matters, so that the EU is stronger to be able to defend its interest, because it is really at risk of losing ground in the context of Russia, of US-China competition, also on what's happening in the Middle East. So I think this is very much driving the French approach to foreign policy, how to build that stronger European Union. That comes with a lot of challenges. How you balance NATO and EU defense policy, for example, this is not an easy debate. And also on economic matters. And I think Macron definitely had a lot of successes at European level on this. If you look at, for example, the answer to the Inflation Reduction Act, this was very much driven by the French approach to state aid and economic subsidies. And this is very much designed, again, to allow European industry, the European economy to maintain some sort of advantage, or at least to maintain its current base in the face of a huge and determined US competition, economic competition, in addition to the Chinese competition. So that's, I think, the economic aspect in here is quite important, and also has been driving the French approach to this.
Okay, interesting. That's obviously until the UK takes France to court for breaching its level playing field obligations, but, you know, we can get on to that. Georgina.
Yeah, always easy to speak after two excellent speakers. So maybe I will pick up on two elements also, like where does Macron take France and what are the major challenges? I think what's very important to understand, also when we look back to 2017, when Macron first took office, is really that idea that France wants to play a role on the global scene and on the international level, but also that France is aware that this idea of a grande puissance or so is outdated, and that France can't play it alone, that France really needs partners for that. And of course, like mentioned by François-Joseph, this idea is, of course, to some extent, France is strong if the EU is strong. So that also explains to some extent why there is so much emphasis given to this idea of a sovereign Europe. And when we're looking back to the speech that Macron gave in 2017 in Paris at the Sorbonne, and his vision on a sovereign Europe, when he talked about tax sovereignty and also EU industrial policy, EU defense budgets, and so on, and we compare that to what we see today, I would argue that Macron has actually managed to make the EU quite French in some regards, and also to arrive at the state where the EU institutions have taken up a lot of the wording that France has been using. But even beyond this, the EU, this idea of partnerships, I think has become increasingly important. We see that on the one hand, on the bilateral level with several EU member states. We saw that there was a sort of defense pact with Greece. France has concluded bilateral or friendship treaties also with Italy and Spain. But we also see that particularly in the Indo-Pacific, with increasing bilateral and also trilateral cooperation. For example, there is one between the United Arab Emirates, India, and France. And in general, France is also really reinforcing its bilateral relationships. When you see the entire agenda of Macron travel to these, particularly to the Indo-Pacific, it's quite interesting that France really plays on this idea of partnerships, which of course also links back to this idea of great power competition. At one point, the French government, and particularly Macron, talked a lot about being a puissance d'équilibre, difficult to translate, maybe a balancing power or a power of the balance, both a bit clumsy in English. But now the idea is really that France sees itself as a power that wants to build coalitions and broad multilateralism outside US-China competition to try to mitigate the consequences of that. And as Georgina said, basically in all aspects of international affairs.
I mean, let me just push you. I'm a bit cynical about things, but you all seem to have bought into the idea that the French sort of reliance on Europe is more than simply I mean, I remember years ago, I don't remember actually, but years ago, Harold Macmillan said about de Gaulle when he says Europe, he means France. And there's always been this slight suspicion that the French use sort of rhetoric about the European Union in a sense to dress up and make slightly more acceptable the pursuit of narrow French national interest. But you all seem to be suggesting that actually there's a recognition on the part of the French now that in order to be able to play the role they want to play, they need a strong European Union. This is actually real and it's not just rhetoric. Is that fair, do you think? Am I out of date, in other words?
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
I think they do see Europe about more than French interest, but it would be great if the Europe were more French. Do you know what I mean? So it sort of goes hand in hand in the sense that I think there's a real recognition, particularly with the war in Ukraine, that France and Germany aren't the only member states calling the shots, and that actually we have to be listening much more to what Central and Eastern Europe say. You've seen, and this extends actually beyond EU member states. Now, France has like quite an effective strategy towards the Balkans, which was in place in 2019. I mean, if you think about what the UK has been doing in the Balkans, it's, there has been a shift and there is more willingness to listen. But I think fundamentally, they feel that their view of how Europe should evolve is probably the right direction, and that's what we should go down. And I agree with Georgina, and I've said it before. I think the EU has never been more French. Everyone's talking about sovereignty. Everyone's talking about now industrialization or reindustrialization, EU industrial strategy, and even if member states don't entirely agree on what that means and whether we should have uncapped state aids and everything else, they are talking much more seriously about, well, actually the EU that we've known and that's been, and in the early 2000s, that it's changing, and the challenges that we face are changing. And actually, if we club together, we will be more effective. So in a way, it's not the taboo that it once was. That even on EU defence, we could be as cynical as we want, and then François Joseph is absolutely right on the questions of EU versus NATO and all the rest of it. We're talking about, really helping European defence industry, and the French are there and they're talking about it, but they're not the only ones. So actually, I do think that their view of how Europe should be has evolved. They are much more willing to speak to people. They do much more outreach, and that's also, I think, really, really shifted under Macron's presidency. But there is now a sort of, in his second term, what can we expect? Is there going to be another speech? What else is he going to put forward? And as we enter in this really crucial electoral period, what will France's view of Europe be? And I'll just end by saying, we know what Macron's very pro-European, but even if we look at Marine Le Pen, she's no longer advocating leaving the EU. She's just advocating for a different kind of EU. So it is broadly, across France, there is, I think, been a shift on the EU and what it does to France.
Well, it has to be said, the EU has been far too French for us Brits for many years, so this is not a new thing. So, François Joseph, do you want to add
I totally agree. I would be maybe a bit more nuanced on the sort of delivery side of things, because it's true that basically France has won many ideological battles at EU level over the past few years on a little bit on defense, but not that much. I will come back to that. But on the economy in particular, on the green agenda, the European policy is shaped by French ideas. And if France was not here to provide those ideas, to stimulate the debate like this, then it's not sure many things would have happened. For example, on the COVID recovery funds. So I think this is quite important. This ideological influence that France had, and that stems from Macron's relentless, making lots of speeches, conceptualizing what the Europe should look like. Sometimes it doesn't come across necessarily as very positive from some member states, but the reality is that it provides the intellectual underpinning of the EU integration, of EU integration policy. Now the problem is in the delivery of all of that, and I think that with a slightly weaker German leadership, France has an issue here in terms of how to advance its interest, its vision of Europe, because it's much more difficult to implement. So I agree with Georgina. I think Macron himself and France in general has made much more efforts to reach out to other countries to explain its approach, try to do a convincing. It's also been much better at building coalitions within the EU, which France wasn't very good at that over the past few decades, let's say. But on nuclear energy, for example, very, very efficient coalition building to defend the role of nuclear energy in the Net Zero Industry Act, for example, or on other policy areas. So all of this is quite important. but France always needs to do more on that side, and it's more difficult because perhaps the German side is not as efficient, let's say, as building what France needs to deliver on its ideas. And on defense policy, just to say, I think this is perhaps one of the areas where things have moved less fast over the past 3 years from a French perspective. And actually, with the Ukraine war, we can almost say that it's been going backwards, really, in many ways, because it was a big objective of the French to move forward on defense policy integration at EU level. But there are huge divergences between member states, including with Germany, on how it should look like. And when you look at the Germans investing a lot in the relation with the US, for example, on defense industry, Poland doing the same, there is a challenge here for the French to try to solve that issue. I don't know how it can be solved because it's very difficult. And I think these countries have taken a very, very fundamentally different path. But this is one of the biggest, I think, challenges for the next few years in terms of defense policy.
And it's interesting, actually, just sort of my own experience talking to diplomats from other EU. There's a lot of muttering amongst the sort of usual suspects about how French the European Union is becoming, and a lot of sort of, oh my God, why did you leave and leave us to this fate sort of thing. But I'm not sure that muttering is anything more than sort of grumbling. I'm not sure what it'll turn into. But Georgina, I'm sorry, I'm making you go last again. Next time you can go first, I promise.
No worries. Maybe first on this idea, like when the French say Europe, they mean France. I mean, France has a bit, I would say, an image problem on this regard as well. Because when France, I would also say, often successfully pushes something on the EU level, that is often framed as something that is purely a method to defend French national interests, although many other states actually do exactly the same on the EU level. That is what the EU is about. So I think it's also really about this idea, or that we often see this process of uploading. Member states come with their ideas, then we have these negotiations, and then we see what's coming out of them. France is just really good, I would say, in pushing these ideas forward, and has really shaped how that, how the EU can work in this regard. I think what is, however, interesting is also that I wouldn't say that there is a total, like that one could accuse France of being stubborn when it comes to adapting to change, because all things EU policy have significantly evolved here in France since the start of Russia's war on Ukraine. I'm thinking, for example, particularly about the enlargement question. In 2018, Macron really clearly opposed to any kind of enlargement. Now France is among the countries that actually push for that. And I think that also shows that there is, I would say, a learning process on EU policy, and that also EU has to be conceptualized very differently now here in Paris. I could also pick up on the defense and security aspect, but maybe I keep that for later when we enter in detail there.
I mean, we'll come back to enlargement and we'll come back to Trump. We're getting quite a lot of questions. I have to say, actually, the one area where I have been spectacularly wrong is I would never have guessed that the French would adapt to relative decline more quickly than us. But actually, you know, UK rhetoric post-2016 has been quite French in the sense that we're sort of holding out for an individual role. And it is striking the degree to which the French now recognize that they want to work with partners and they need the institutional links in the European Union. But there's a lot of questions in one way or another coming in about domestic politics here. So I'm going to frame it in two questions to you. The first is, to what extent does any of this matter domestically? I mean, actually, in the UK recently, I think we're seeing a greater interlinkage between domestic and foreign policy, whether it's Ukraine and, you know, energy costs, whether it's China and economic trade-offs. But there is a linkage between international and domestic now that makes these things. I mean, it's not, you know, our election is not going to be decided on foreign policy, but it's relevant now to political debate in a way it wasn't. Is that true for France as well? And I suppose the second thing is, do the different parties have different visions to, I mean, we're obviously going to have a change of president next time, but does that mean we're going to have a change of foreign policy? Or do you I mean, you hinted earlier, Georgie, at the fact that even, I was going to say Marine Le Pen isn't going to leave the European Union. Is there broad consensus across parties as to the direction of travel? So there's two questions. And Georgina, I'm going to pick on you and make you go first this time.
Great. I'd start with the second question on the different parties and the different visions. I think, of course, it's still way too early to say what's going to happen in 2027, because the entire question of internal leadership of La République En Marche, or now Renaissance, like Macron's party, is still pretty much up in the air. And I think the EU elections next year, when we see how the party has performed there and who were the leading heads in this campaign, can already give us a hint where they are going. So I think overall, for the centrist parties, like whether it's Macron's party, Renaissance, or also the center-right, like the Républicains, it's clear that EU exit or something like that is not going to happen. Although like Renaissance is much more pro-European and makes it much more a topic than Renaissance does that, because there are, however, critical voices in that. And I think what's very revealing regarding the entire question of what's the direction of travel for France on Europe, and also how do parties see that, is to look a bit at public opinion. Because what's often forgotten is that although France at the moment has an extremely pro-European government, structurally speaking, France is not the most pro-European country in the EU. So only a slight majority, for example, of the French, that's what we see when we look at the Eurobarometer, are convinced that the introduction of the euro was a good thing for France. And when we look at, for example, other studies, we see that around 60% think the EU has a positive influence in the world. So these numbers are not strikingly high. And that is also, for example, reflected when you look at the leftist party or bloc, which is currently led by Mélenchon. It's called La France Insoumise. And for them, the idea is either the EU is reformed or we leave it because we don't like it the way it is. Whereas for Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National, the idea is much more, we don't like the EU as it is, but leaving the EU, and I think Brexit has played a significant role here, is not a good idea because it's just a huge hassle. So it's better to reform and go back to a Europe of nations where you really have sovereign states instead of doing a more integration, or instead of going out. And then on the other side, you have, of course, this pro-European renaissance. And I would say in 2017, when we had this populist wave in Europe, that was potentially also a fact why Macron actually worked well for citizens, because he was the entire counter model to anything that was seen on the populist scene in other European states. But as things stand today, I wouldn't say that European affairs or the question of European integration is a major issue for European citizens, rather the issues that are following from that.
François-Joseph?
Yeah, so I mean, on foreign policy being a determining factors of domestic politics, I think it's usually not the case. It's usually not a determining factor, but we've seen in 2022 the impact of the Ukraine war on the presidential election. We've seen now what's going on with Israel and Gaza and what impact it has on the left of the political spectrum in particular. So we can see these issues creeping into the domestic political debate much more than they used to be, and bringing quite significant changes in the domestic politics. So I think that's something that is quite important to look at. And I would add to that also, we haven't touched on that yet, but French policy in Africa is also something quite important. And the decline of influence of France in this region has also implications domestically on immigration and stuff like that. So we are seeing all of this being very, very closely linked, domestic policy and foreign policy. On EU policy specifically, I think this is definitely something that is absolutely central because, and it's central because it's central to Macron's view of the world and view of his own politics and also political legacy. I think if there is one issue on which he hasn't changed since 2017, and maybe even before, it's European policy. So, and I think we are going to see towards the end of the second of his second term, an emphasis on this much more, because the domestic political scene is going to be much more challenging with no majority in parliament. Probably the EU election next year are not going to go very well, so it will probably end up a bit weaker, but it will still have the European dimension to focus on, because basically, I mean, the government and the president can do a lot without parliament's approval, or without necessarily a very strong domestic political situation to move forward on the EU, which is something quite different from, I think, situation in Germany, for example. So I think he's going to invest a lot in that, not just because he believes in it, because it's part of his political legacy and what he wants to leave after he's gone in 2027. So I think this is something important. In terms of the differences between political parties, I think we are going to see the European issue as being extremely important in the French political context more and more, on specific policy issues, policy areas, for example, immigration. And you can see, for example, the center-right party, Les Républicains, becoming much tougher when it comes to what the EU is doing on immigration. Some people within the Républicains talk about the ECFR almost in the same terms as people in the Conservative Party in the UK will talk about that. So there is a toughening of the position, which is very different from the center or the left position on this. So I think the EU is going to become a divisive issue, but it's not going to go as far as some political parties advocating for France leaving the EU. I think we are past that debate, but it's about how to make the EU more facilitate basically French domestic policy and political objectives.
Just give it a few years till we have 5% growth and France doesn't. We'll see what happens. Anyway, Georgie.
I mean, everything was really well put by José François Joseph. I just think on the first question, you've seen an increase, and there's French interesting polling that came out from Kantar that's now no longer called Kantar, but they have a new name. But they've just published some really interesting data looking at how the French are reacting to French media, and they've seen a significant spike in people's interest in current affairs, directly linked to what's happening in the rest of the world. I think François Joseph is absolutely right to point out the sort of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. I think France has the largest Muslim and Jewish community, and the left have clearly taken a side, or the far left have taken a side in this conflict. It really feels like this is playing out in France, and it has huge repercussions on a number of issues. I think on where what would French foreign policy look like in 2027 just seems right. We can look at what's happening the far right, the far left, but actually it really also depends on what happens to the centre, and it's too early to say there. But I think French foreign policy could become much more transactional. So if you look at Marine Le Pen and what when she doesn't talk all that much about the EU actually, but when she does, it's quite interesting. And she says things, for example, she gave a really interesting interview in La Repubblica, which is one of the main Italian newspapers, and she basically completely dissed Meloni, who's the Italian prime minister, saying, she's not, basically she's just playing the kind of, she's being a technocrat, she's not delivering on what she promised, she's playing the EU game, and really critical of her approach. So I think if we had a Marine Le Pen president, we'd have someone who wouldn't hesitate to try and hold as much as possible the EU hostage to get what she wanted, but she might find it quite difficult, because of course it depends on who your partners are, who's willing to side with you inside the EU, and it's not like you can always pull out the unanimity card. So I think we could see it much more transactional. I think with Germany it would become much more difficult. This is on the right, the left, but also the centrist parties. You do hear much more criticism of Germany looking inwards, Germany not playing the European card, Marine Le Pen going as far as saying Germany just uses France for its cheap electricity. I mean, it could become very ugly. So I think we could expect a more transactional foreign policy, but again, it's far too early to say.
I mean, there's a really interesting discussion to be had on the role of minority communities and how their politics is shaped by foreign policy. Which we're just starting to have in the UK, actually. I mean, it became an issue when Corbyn's Labour Party passed a resolution about Kashmir, and the Indian community's political preferences seem to shift, but we might do a comparative panel across European countries one day. But no, there's a very specific question, and I am going to get to the UK and the E3 in a minute. I'm just enjoying this too much for the moment. The specific question I've had in, and you don't all need to answer this, but is, will the European political community survive Macron? That's to say, will there be such, will any putative likely successor be as enthused about it as he is, do we think?
I'm happy to go first on that. I think it's going to survive, yeah, because I mean it's been quite successful, to be fair, in terms of the attendees, the number of meetings that have already happened, and the UK is going to host the next one. I think. Yeah. So that's I think it's starting to be embedded into the European foreign policy security environment. And I think a lot of people find it quite useful to be able to meet different head of state and head of governments that they don't usually have the chance to meet otherwise. But I think that will require commitment particularly from the UK. I think because it's a big part of the success, I think, of the political community is about the UK playing a positive role in this. And so it's very positive, I think, that they accepted to join this format. I think the big question for the European political community is it going actually to achieve anything? I would say talking to each other is already something positive. And I think the expectation is not much more than that at the moment, but to be able to really become something that is truly considered as useful, there need to be some kind of concrete deliverables. Be it on moving forward on the resolution of conflict in the periphery of the EU, for example, fostering the discussions on enlargement as well. And I think longer term, I think the EPC could really play the role of the sort of outer circle of the EU that Macron has been talking about in terms of the way the EU should move forward, particularly an enlarged EU should move forward. So I think this is the premise of the starting point of that idea. But it will need people to take this forward after it's gone, and that's going to be one of the issues.
I think one of the things certainly I sort of hadn't really grasped when the EPC was launched was just how important it is for our politicians and our Prime Minister to give them an opportunity to meet in the margins with other European leaders, because the TCA is so thin and there's no provision for those sorts of meetings for the UK Prime Minister. So the EPC has been invaluable, I think, for Sunak to actually have those conversations in the margins with other European leaders. So in that sense, which I realise isn't why Macron set it up, but thank you from us, I suppose, for that element of it. Does anyone else want to come in? You don't need to. I mean, if you think that answer.
Happy to jump in here.
Yeah.
I would say maybe, or I share optimism, but I would say it's cautious optimism regarding the EPC. And I think that potentially the next summit in the UK can be the point where we are going to see whether it's going to survive in the long term and whether it's going to have a value. The last summit, for example, wasn't attended by Azerbaijan and Turkey, although the participation of these two would have been potentially most relevant, not most relevant, but very relevant in light of the crisis that we are seeing in the neighborhood. And if players with whom you actually want to talk don't attend, then even a talking shop is losing a bit of value. But I fully agree that it is extremely helpful to have these informal bilaterals, minilaterals, and also come out there with kind of joint declaration in smaller formats. I think that the last summit was really, everyone went in there with managed expectations. Nobody was looking for a big political leap forward also. But if the next summit continues in the same sense, and if it becomes a talking shop and participation declines and so on, then there is, of course, the question on how helpful it still is. So I think France, there is really a window of opportunity for France and the UK to jointly set a positive agenda for this summit, and then also prove the actual added value of this format.
Okay, interesting. Can I crack on, Georgia, or do you want to? I mean, there's something I am going to get onto the UK next, but there's one question I have to ask because everyone sort of talks about it, and I'm not sure I'm any clearer about what it means. A Trump presidency, what what does that, I mean, does the Trump presidency give Macron the chance to say, I was right all along, and if you'd listened to me on strategic autonomy, we'd be further ahead now? But I mean, what practically do you think it changes insofar as we can tell? Georgie, go on then.
I mean, I was in Washington in October, and pretty much the working hypothesis was Trump has a very realistic chance of winning. And if you look at his campaign, the Heritage Foundation have a whole website where they're basically designing his policy program for, I mean, it's quite clear what direction the US is under Trump too would go down, and it would be a very different, I think, presidency than the first one. So we think we know what Trump president would be like, but I think his return would be very different. You know, there was a Rolling Stones article that was pretty clear, talking to lots of people on this campaign, that, you know, Trump is quite serious about potentially pulling the US out of NATO. I think if EU countries went up to him and said, you know, what would it take for you to stay? He would probably say something like, well, if you tomorrow triple your defense budget, then I might consider staying. So I think there is that, you know, you don't really know. And I think that's the lesson we can take away from the first, you know, Trump presidency is he's quite unpredictable. He can change his mind. But I think we should take very seriously the prospect that is something that is on the table and that is being discussed in his campaign. And so actually we should prepare for that. I think, you know, there will be part of the French elite that will, I think, and I'm looking at François-Joseph for this, but that will want to say, well, we were right all along, we've been saying this all along. And it dates back all the way to Suez, right? Where the lesson for the UK was we need to grow closer to the United States, and France took the opposite lesson, which is we need to place distance. But then actually, if you read France's national security review, they say that the US is their, you know, one of their most important allies. In fact, I think the most important ally. So it's always you know, we work where we can, but we should be mindful that the US will not they will undercut us. They will try and kill our competition and all of that kind of stuff. And that's going to be a key driver. But I think there will be people saying we were right all along, but I think the majority, particularly in the French government, will be like, no, we need to be talking to our EU partners right now, and we need to be preparing for that prospect, because we can't wait until November 2024 to plan for it. And actually, in a weird way, I think it provides an opportunity to think more constructively and as Europeans, not just the EU, about what we would do if we had a Trump presidency, or for that matter, a continuation of Biden or a different kind of president altogether.
I mean, arguably, we've left it a bit late now to start thinking about it now, haven't we? But anyway, who wants to? Anyone?
Yeah, just to jump in on Georgina's last point, because I think it's important also to acknowledge the fact that even if Biden is reelected, I think there is still a question for Europeans about the commitment of the US to European security, and what it means for European strategic autonomy and all of that. So a Trump presidency would see much more sudden change to the current situation. But I think the US is in a trajectory, and I think that's France's approach. It's a trajectory which is away from seeing European security as central. And regardless of which administration is in power in Washington, this is something that Europeans need to take into account. And when you look again at the Inflation Reduction Act, and when you see US embassies in the EU openly, chasing European companies to ask them to invest in the US, you can see that the competition is happening here, regardless of which administration it is. There are underlying dynamics that I think, Europeans need to understand. I think France is going to play a big role in trying to raise awareness on to address these issues. And one of the issues of all is pivot to Asia, and the US being much more focused on China in the next few years.
I would like to pick up on that point of rising awareness among Europeans for different scenarios, which I think is incredibly important, because if there is one country in the EU, or let's say one European country in NATO, that can basically make these remarks and kind of push Europeans to think a bit about this scenario of the US either very suddenly under Trump, or slowly but steadily pulling out of Europe and shifting responsibility to Europeans. The country that can push other Europeans to think about concrete scenarios is France, because France has often been considered a bit, I don't want to say the troublemaker in NATO, but like let's say, an ally that has often been a bit critical, and that with its push for strategic autonomy, also since 2017, has, I think, been really often criticized on its position in the transatlantic alliance, although this entire idea of strategic autonomy was basically never about European solo riding. But it acknowledges the reality that Europeans might not always find common ground with the US. And France is actually the country that pushes other Europeans to consider that. And I think regardless of whether we see a Trump or a Biden scenario, there is a good chance that France will continue to push Europeans to do more, either really as Europeans or within the EU. Because, as said previously, Biden's administration might be much nicer in tone, but many of the policies that we see are pretty much a continuation of everything we see since Obama, and that is a shift away from Europe.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's 22. Better late than never. I better shift quickly onto the UK and onto the E3, I suppose, though I'm quite enjoying this. Where does the UK fit in all of this, in France's strategic vision? I mean, is there a specific place for the UK? Has AUKUS made things harder than they otherwise would have been? Is the UK a privileged partner still in the way that it's been spoken of in the past? Any or all of those questions to any or all of you?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Oh no,
you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay.
Let's have some chaos.
Nice. Okay, then I jump on that chaos and go first. So I would say the UK has always had a special place in French security, defense policy, and also more broadly as a foreign policy partner, which is also, I would say, because they look pretty much like strategic twins. Similar size, similar economic performance, or like GDP, both members of UN Security Council, also both, I would say, increasing strategic convergence. For example, when we look at how they see and how they analyze what is happening in geopolitics on the global level, importance of the Indo-Pacific. So there is a lot of convergence between the two of them. And there is also a lot, I think, where they can work on. The elephant in the room is, of course, always European defense. And that question on whether they want to work together or wanted together when the UK was still a member in the EU, and how they can work together in NATO. But I think there is overall really room for UK-French, co-leadership on all the questions of having a bigger European responsibility when it comes to European security and defense. And also, for example, in the European political community, because there is really a good forum to bring the UK closer to France.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You're all allowed to disagree, at some point, if you want. That's fine.
I will disagree a little bit in the second part of my answer. But to start with, I agree with the fact that, that there is no question that the UK is a privileged partner for France in particular when it comes to defense and security. It's a natural partner because of what I said about the similarities between the two countries, and also because France and the UK are two nuclear powers, and I think that also makes a big difference in terms of the depth, basically, of the relationship, of the cooperation that the two countries have on fundamental issues. Now, the problem is, from my perspective, is that there has been a divergence over the past few years between the two countries. And that also stems from Brexit, from the fact that contacts between the two countries have been much less frequent. And France has heavily invested in the EU and in the relationship with Germany, for better and worse. And the UK on its side has invested a lot on its relationship with the US and other partners such as the Five Eyes, and that was demonstrated with the AUKUS agreement. And I think these policy decisions really show the fundamental divergence between the two countries, and I see some difficulties to reconcile that in the longer term. And I think the translation of that is that, unfortunately, the depth of the relationship, of the cooperation on defense, are still, I mean, people might disagree on that, but I think are still not recovered from what it was before Brexit, and from the ambition that was demonstrated back in 2010 when the two countries signed the Lancaster House Agreement, which are a really ambitious agreement about defense cooperation, including on the industry side. So I think there is a really an open question about how this divergence lead us in the next few years and in the longer term.
Georgie.
I mean, very quickly, it's a bit of a roller coaster relationship over the past couple of years. I mean, so I think back to 2017 and 2018, it just felt like it was very hard to be a Brit in Paris. I think it was quite hard to be a French person in London at that time. It was, you know, they weren't talking, they disagreed openly. You know, Brexit, actually, the very beginning of the Brexit negotiations, France wanted as much as possible to separate the Brexit negotiations from the bilateral relationship. Inevitably, it bled in, and then we had AUKUS, and we had so many other things that came out. And then just because they weren't speaking as much, I think that mistrust grew, and then it became distrust, and it was it. But I think looking at where we are now, I think the war in Ukraine definitely brought them closer together. If you asked me what's the major event that brought them together, it's that. And there's been lots of strategic thinking, many more high-level conversations, and not just about European security. It also extends to, you know, the Sahel, the Indo-Pacific. I think François-Joseph is right that it's probably not what it used to be. But I also think that in Paris, at least, there's sometimes a conversation that France is quite strategically alone, and it, you know, will feel la solitude. It's sort of, sometimes it feels quite alone, and it doesn't really have partners. And I think sometimes there's a look at London thinking, gosh, London's gone through, you know, the UK's gone through Brexit, and yet they seem to be just having all these like partnerships and announcing new partnerships and new initiatives, and is there something to be learned there? But I think there's definitely willingness and appetite to deepen that relationship. But the question is, how do you do it? And how do you do it when you have the EU being such a central focus for France, and the UK having a very different type of conversation about what it wants? So it's not always easy, but I think there's definitely willingness on both sides.
And it's worth, in that context, I think, just reminding ourselves how personalised the antagonisms became, because, you know, President Macron was, for many Brexiters, to use an English phrase, a bit of the bête noire of the Brexit process, wasn't he? You know, he was named as the person making it difficult. I mean, it all became very unpleasant. So in that sense, I buy this. But is it, I suppose, one big question, given the direction of travel of the European Union on economic matters, by which I mean not only the response to IRA, but also the way the European Defence Fund has been structured. Is it possible for us to be close allies in security and defence terms and staunch economic competitors with the UK essentially pushed out of sort of collaborative programs? Does that work medium term? Is there a way of balance? I mean, that's always struck me as the big challenge of Brexit, how you do those two things simultaneously. And is there a problem there? Am I being too negative?
Well, the question is whether you would want that to be staunch competitors. So, I mean, there will always be, I think, a degree of competition between the EU economy and the British economy. But the fact that the EU is seriously talking with countries on the other end of the world about free trade agreements, and we are very, very far from seeing that, or seeing really like let's say, a very constructive relationship in terms of economic matters between the UK and the EU, I think is quite concerning, because even from a geographical point of view, it doesn't really make sense. And I think also there were many aspects that haven't been addressed in this regard over the last years. And when, for example, the UK and the EU are serious about this idea of also potentially to better control supply chains, think about having more production and so on in Europe, it would be a natural partnership to think about things like, for example, also potentially things like an energy market or just easy trade of energy and that kind of stuff together and not against each other.
I think just on this, I think, and coming back to your comment, Anand. I think it's not about the UK becoming a key partner for the EU in terms of foreign policy and security. It already is a key partner for the EU on these issues. And I think and despite Brexit and all of that, we found ways to continue the dialogue. And I think the E3 is a good example of that, because on issues like Iran, like specific crises, this format has still functioned quite well. But the question is how we put together a framework for that cooperation to maybe deepen a little bit, to continue to move forward. And I think what Labour is saying in terms of maybe building a foreign policy and security framework with the EU, that's something interesting, and that will be seen positively from the EU side. But then the question is, when it comes to specific institutions and getting closer to the European Defence Fund, to some of the EU's foreign policy initiatives, then the question is for the UK, to what extent he accepts the cost of these, of getting closer to these initiatives, political cost, but also cost in terms of sovereignty, maybe in terms of how we work together, and that still needs to be worked out. But I think there is definitely a willingness on both sides to try to build that framework.
Can I quickly, and then jump in, because often we talk about governments and political relations and stuff like that, but ultimately when it comes to industry, it's also where industry wants to invest. And actually, if you look at sort of Airbus or MBDA, they're perfect examples of Franco-British or European-wide cooperation that transcends the EU's borders and that's working. French industry, whether it's EDF, I think even Engie, that are heavily, and then RATP. You've got loads of companies that are present in the UK that are heavily invested. There's a lot of kind of business to business things, and I think, frankly, that sort of almost saved the Franco-British relationship at those the depths of 2017, 2018, because there was a push to kind of maintain that ongoing dialogue. So I think solutions can be found. The only thing, and I completely agree with François-Joseph on EU funding and Defence Agency and all of that kind of stuff. France isn't alone deciding what's happening. If it's not, it doesn't always strike me that member states are exactly clamoring for the EU to open its doors to the UK either. So I think there is a real strategic conversation to be had about the future of defence industry Europe-wide. And I think what would help is if you had, and it's already better than it was, but a good working relationship between the UK and the EU that goes beyond the TCA. And then that might foster better environment to have more strategic discussions.
So given this, and you'll see how cleverly I brought this around to the subject that we were meant to be discussing from the start, what is the institutional framework for this? Is it bilateral France-UK? Is it via the E3 as a way of doing things sort of shorn of the constraints of some of the more troublesome member states, if you like? Is it via a UK-EU formal security partnership? Is it a bit of each, in which case, which does what? I mean, how, just looking ahead slightly, how would you envisage this partnership, if it is to work as well as we all seem to think it should? How should it be structured?
I think it's all of the above.
Okay.
And I would add to that also the level higher, which is, for example, the coordination of the G7 level, which we have seen in the sanctions discussion, for example, against Russia, has been absolutely essential. But I think the endpoint, or the objective, the ultimate objective, I think, is to have a structured framework for dialogue on foreign policy and security and defense between the EU and the UK, because this is the direction of travel. And I think France also, there is a willingness on the EU side to intensify cooperation at EU level. So the UK should see that trend and accompany it by, pitching. I think Labour proposal is makes sense to me, at least, to have this cooperation at that level. But that doesn't mean that bilateral relations are not going to be important. They are still going to be important. The E3, I think, is absolutely vital, because it deals with central issues like Iran and other crises when maybe sometimes the EU system is not as fast moving, and we need a European position faster between the UK and Germany and France first. So that's useful to have. But ultimately, yes, I think it's the EU-UK framework that needs to be built.
I mean, I'll say in parentheses to the other two of you, I mean, is Germany capable of fast decisions in any framework at the moment? I mean, that's one of the problems, but anyway.
Can I'm a bit pessimistic about the E3, to be honest. I think it could have been used several times. In fact, Joseph and I have spoken in the past about the E3, and I just don't think it's being used. And sometimes it's because there's a problem on the Franco-British side. Now maybe you could say that there's also a problem on the Franco-German side, and it feels like that's really impeding. And also, I think beyond that, can you really still have a conversation between the UK, France, and Germany that will in some way set the scene for the rest of the EU? I mean, I think there are countries like Poland that might feel that actually, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We want to be part of that conversation. And it's quite interesting and Georgina's done lots of work on this on the Weimar Triangle and how that's kind of brought about. In Paris, people are talking much more about that with the election, the Polish election, and how that might change dynamics and stuff like that. So I think it is useful, and I completely agree with the need for it. I don't really hear anyone in Paris talk about the E3, and that doesn't mean it's not a good idea, but I think it just shows that inherently at the moment it's still the bilateral card that trumps the sort of multilateral or minilateral, and even when it comes to the G7, I think you've got a German government that, exactly as you said, coalition partners that radically disagree on lots of stuff. You have a chancellor that can promise something to a French president and go back to Berlin and have, the minister for the economy who's like, no, I'm not going to do that, and there's literally nothing he can do. So it's quite difficult in that sort of scenario to see how this would work, but maybe down the line.
Yeah, maybe to pick up in a similar direction, I think that E3 theoretically has a lot of potential, but with the current German government, I think it's very complicated also because the Franco-German relationship at the moment is certainly not the best one. They disagree on almost all major issues in the EU. And I have the impression that makes it a bit difficult for them to basically go to or to leave that behind and to see where you could find common ground with the UK. And actually, I think that could be a window of opportunity to say, okay, we're trying to leave all the things that impede the Franco-German relationship in the EU at the moment, and we see what we can do outside the EU with the UK. But I agree with Georgina that needs also, or should potentially at one point also include Poland. Although it could be interesting also to reflect as Europeans in smaller group formats, for example, on long-term support for Ukraine. Because while we already see how much support there is from all Europeans, the reflections on how Ukraine's long-term future in Europe looks like and how providing security there looks like are not really ongoing. And there could actually be a very good window of co-leadership, because that should be something where they find common ground, particularly considering what we already touched upon, the trajectory of slow decreasing US interest in Europe at one point.
So I just wonder, on the basis of what you've all said, whether you think that the priority is to institutionalize the UK-EU security relationship ahead of everything else. I mean, the TCA, as we know, is very thin. The sort of security relationship mooted in the political declaration of 2019 never materialized because Boris Johnson said he didn't want it. Is that the priority? I suppose I'm going to ask you two questions because we've got about two, and you've got 2 minutes between you to answer them both. And I suppose the second question, going back to Trump, is whether a Donald Trump presidency might be the fillip that is needed to get the E3 working again, because then you do need quick reactions, and then you do need to make some decisions, and then, the three most powerful European states really will need to take seriously the prospect of working together, particularly if that Trump administration, as Georgie alluded to, seriously undermines NATO.
Yeah, happy to start here. Trump as a catalyst for E3, potentially to certainly, yes. Geopolitical shocks work very well to put the three of them together and to force them to cooperate. And that could certainly be a case. Do we need institutionalized cooperation between the EU and the UK? I'm not so sure. We saw also with PESCO military mobility that kind of this plug-in mechanism works. So if there is more plug-in potential for the UK and true willingness in London also to think about like more flexible, more ad hoc cooperation with the EU, I don't think that institutionalizing should be the #1 priority.
François-Joseph, do you want to?
Yeah, sure.
The last word.
I think EU-UK framework is a priority, but it's also a low-hanging fruit. I think it's perhaps in the EU-UK relation what can be achieved the quickest, because when you look at other issues, trade, customs, stuff like that, it's extremely difficult to change the TCA and to achieve significant results. That because you get into conversation about the customs union, the single market, and all of that. So I think this is something that can be achieved quite quickly. It's not going to change things overnight because EU-UK are still cooperating quite closely on foreign policy matters. But I think it's something that would be a good starting point to do. On the E3 and the US, I think let's remember that the E3 is originally it's an experts format, right? It's a format of cooperation between experts. So we should not expect too much of them. But I agree with you. I mean, the three major European countries should get together more closely, and maybe it's a way for them to kickstart that conversation we were talking about, to anticipate what a consequence for Europe a new Trump presidency would be. But let's not have too many expectations for the E3 because it's not been designed to be a very strong element of cooperation at the political level, at the higher level. So yeah, I would just keep that in mind on
that. Very quickly, I sort of don't always think institutionalizing the relationship is definitely the way to improve the partnership. I think just seeing more of each other, like François-Joseph said, one of the big consequences of Brexit is just that Europeans don't see their British counterparts as much. So I think when you had the Russia invaded Ukraine, you had Liz Truss, who was then Foreign Secretary, and Tony Blinken from the US, and then their Canadian colleague who came and attended a Foreign Affairs Council. I think there are ways that you can kind of sort of periodically, say every 6 months, we meet and we have a high level of strategic dialogue, and then all the build up with diplomats beforehand. And that's as good, I think, as having a treaty or whatever it is. And I think the EU has, sometimes it feels like a closer relationship with Japan than it has with the UK. And I just think that's not normal, nor is it very strategic for either side. And finally, does Trump provoke a bringing closer together? I think, yes, inevitably, but it's a bit sad that it has to come to that. For us to be thinking more strategically about the future of Europe and frankly the world order and what we need to do together. I think you're on mute.
There we go, rookie error. Couldn't agree more on that last point, Georgie, but we've run out of time, which is a shame because I could have talked about this. This takes me back to my sort of PhD days working on French foreign policy, so it's been quite nice. But first and foremost, thank you to our audience. Thanks for all the questions. I haven't got through them all, but I think we've got through a lot of them. And particular thanks to Jésine, François-Joseph, and Georgie. Always a pleasure to see you. We might do this again actually soon because I've enjoyed it so much. So be prepared to get that email. Before we go, I've got to give a heads up to other events. On Friday lunchtime, we've got our economics panel discussing the autumn statement. I've been getting lots of notifications about tax cuts while this event has been going on. So we'll be poring over the autumn statement, what it means, what it might mean for an election. Next Tuesday, we've got our next lunch hour, which is on US, UK, and EU foreign policy. Next Wednesday, we've got the final installment of this series on the E3, which is an in-person event looking more broadly at European security and where the E3 might sit in that, which is a really, really good panel. So come along if you can. And finally, on the 5th of December, for those who are interested, we've got a big conference on the state of public opinion in the UK. And after that, we'll all be ready for Christmas, I imagine. But for now, thank you all so much. Thank you, you three in particular. Enjoy the rest of your day and take care. Bye.